Hello and welcome to ATG the podcast, and I'm very pleased to be talking to Gary Price today. Gary, you must be one of the best known names in the whole of scholarly publishing, because for many people news comes via one of your channels. So let's talk a little bit about your background and then get up to date. So you are actually a qualified librarian.
Yes, I am a qualified librarian. I am from Chicago. I was born and raised in the Chicago suburbs. I like to say my best friend played in Cyrano de Bergerac with Rainn Wilson, who played Dwight on the U.S. version of The Office. My high school is very well known for people in the arts and music. I wasn't one of those people. So New Trier High School, Chicago suburbs, went to the University of Kansas, came back to Chicago, and I had never thought about becoming a librarian. I was working for a chain of suburban newspapers in Chicago, and it wasn't what I had hoped for or what I wanted, and it was, of all people, my mother who said, maybe you should consider about becoming a librarian. And it was the best advice and suggestion that I ever got. She was absolutely right. I was the kid who would go to the library on a Saturday, and because they were closed on Sunday, can I take home a few reference books? I have always been enamored with facts and reference and how it's organized and how it's updated, blah, blah, blah. So I left Chicago with my then girlfriend, now wife. In 1993, we moved to Detroit, where I went to the Wayne State Library School, Library and Information Science program. Graduated from there, and in 1996 came to DC area to work for George Washington University. In 2001, I co-authored a book called The Invisible Web, which has become synonymous with the deep web, but it's really not synonymous, blah, blah, blah. We'll save that for another interview. And in September 2001, after spending so much time doing speaking and all that, the university was great to me, but they said you either have to be here a little bit more or not. I decided to make a go of it as a consultant, and that was 25 years ago. And from that point on, I've been doing a lot of consulting work for any number of organizations, in addition to doing a website for Library Journal called InfoDOCKET.
Well, we'll come back to that. So the job you had at George Washington University was, at least for a time, you were actually a reference librarian. So does the reference librarian still exist?
Well, that was 2001 and 2026. Do they exist for a lot of people? That's questionable. Should they exist? Absolutely. I think one of the biggest issues of my career, and it directly relates to your question, is do people even know that this profession exists anymore? Everybody has very positive thoughts about libraries and librarians, the iconic nature of the building, the importance of what we do. But I have noticed, especially in the last, everything is out the window now with AI, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point. But, my career really parallels the internet as a research tool. So first we had the internet, people were chatting and email, that kind of thing. Then along came this thing called Google, and then along came this thing called Wikipedia. But something that goes throughout my career is we don't do a very good job of telling people what we do, the resources we offer, and how those resources can save them time, effort, aggravation. It used to be trying to convince people about credibility, trying to get them even aware of that concept of credibility of source, credibility of information was a challenge. That has become to some degree easier because of what's going on with AI and deep fakes and all of that. But again, I think one of the biggest issues is that people, the general public there, I should say, they feel good about libraries, but they really don't know what libraries and librarians do, the resources we offer, and that our skills are still very valuable.
And one of the things that I can't help noticing about libraries is that quite what those skills are seems to have changed quite a bit in the last 25 years, but hopefully that will become clearer as we go on. So you say you've been a consultant for 25 years, but actually you've spent some time with some quite high-profile companies. You worked for a while with Ask.com, which was at the time very well known.
Yeah, I was there for about 2 years. They wanted to have somebody with a library background on board. I was there. There's actually, if you go into Google or Internet Archive, there's an article. I started there the day they retired the Butler logo. I started there the day Jeeves was retired,
Mm.
and there was an article, somebody cute headline: Is Gary Price the new Butler?" type of thing. So yes, I was working for them for a while. Matter of fact, some of the things that Jeeves was doing at that point are now commonplace. The search inside of a specific area, more than the 10 blue links, that kind of concept. But even at that point, this is 05, 06, 07, it was difficult to get people to even take a look at something other than Google. I would be doing some internal work for them, but I would also be briefing the media. And it was very nice of them that they allowed me, when I would be briefing the media, to end the call by saying, "You're at the Houston Chronicle. Do you have any idea of some of the resources that are available via the Houston Public Library or whatever library?" And inevitably, the journalists would have no idea about what I was talking about, whether it be Houston or any other city. And I think for a lot of people, that is still true today, at least here in the United States and to some degree in Canada and elsewhere around the world. Australia comes to mind. Public libraries, for example, are offering all sorts of remotely accessible tools and databases from the vendors that we talk about at Charleston and elsewhere. But it's been my experience that even people with a library card, so that's one level above just the average person walking down the street, but even people who are qualified with a library card who have one, have no idea about the remotely accessible resources that the library offers. And I find that both to be motivating, gives me something to talk about, but also a bit challenging in the fact that here is quality, well-organized information, whatever you want to call it. People are actually paying for it with their tax dollars. Somebody has to subsidize the cost, but most people don't even know that those resources exist. They still have this mindset the library is a physical building, which it is, and an important building in the community. But in many situations, those resources are now available 24/7, 365, whether you're in the building or you're 35,000 feet above the Atlantic. If you have Wi-Fi access, you have access to a lot of information. But again, we don't do a very good job. The collective we don't do a very good job of letting people know that these resources exist and why they would want to use them, when they would want to use them, so on and so forth.
You're absolutely right. I discovered a lovely example of this. I discovered just a couple of weeks ago. My library gives me access to Spanish language newspapers, which would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to buy in any other form. Or at least very expensive. So no, you're absolutely
And you have access
right.
to those Spanish language newspapers in many cases, same day, full image, full text. I mean, it's just incredible what's out there. But if people don't know that it exists in any sense, where does the responsibility lie to let them know that it exists and how it can be useful to them if that's one of their information needs? We could go back and forth for hours on where the responsibility lies, but it lies somewhere. Otherwise, I think we're probably close to a time where some of these resources, or a lot of them, are going to stop existing for libraries, in the sense that, if you got rid of a lot of this stuff, with budgets being what they are, and I think right now we've been saying this for a while, but right now we are at that point, that if you got rid of some of this stuff, yes, you might get a little bit of pushback, but you're not going to get a lot of pushback because most people don't even know that these things are available in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is one of the things that one of the benefits I think that you bring to the party, in that through your updates and your news services, you're making people aware of things that they wouldn't otherwise know. And one of the examples of something that I don't know if you invented the phrase, but the idea of vertical search engine seems to be quite associated with you. So tell us about a vertical search engine.
Well, no, it is definitely not a term that I invented, but we would call it, I think what you're getting at is specialty search based on a specific topic. And I think that's a huge opportunity. It continues to be. Smaller is often better. We're even seeing that with AI as well. A smaller context can often produce better results. That's something that I think we might be seeing more of in the future. I also think number one thing that goes along right with what you mentioned is the role of curation. Whether the quality information, however you define quality, but the credible, timely information, wherever it might exist, I think the library and the librarian have a huge role of bringing it all together and making it a seamless package for the end user, often at the time of need, and allowing them to use that collection as needed. And I think with AI and other tools, over the last year, I've become a big fan of Google Notebook. I love that concept. Matter of fact, I'm speaking later this week, or we're presenting later this week at the CNI conference here. And I've created a notebook with my partner, Peter Brantley, that will have 50 resources, both audio, video, and journal articles and news articles on the topic MCP that we're talking about at the conference. So here is my skills to curate everything from a disparate number of sources, put it all together, and now people can query it as an AI tool. And I think that's a huge opportunity for our community to be building these resources, often at the time of need, but making the selection, because there is so much information out there, however you define it.
That's exactly the point.
And people need help. People need help putting it together.
Yeah, that's exactly the point I was going to make, that there's a proliferation of news, but a desperate need to have some sort of selection, some sort of judgment, some sort of validation. And I noticed that you worked for a time with Search Engine Watch as a news editor. But I think, but you tell me. But I think what's most valuable is when you're sort of selecting from that news and sort of saying what is important.
And that's exactly right. I go through thousands and thousands of news items a day, however you define news, and we could get into that if you'd like. But I'm going to traditional news sources. I'm going directly to the source, which I think adds huge amounts of value. And I'm making some decision about what to include and what not to include. And I have to tell you, that has been one of the most valuable things I have learned, both as a curator, as a librarian, and just as a human being, that less is more for most people. So in addition to InfoDOCKET, one of the best things about what I'm doing now in my consulting work is I do a daily newsletter for the Association of Research Libraries called ARL Day in Review. And we could go into how that started, but long story short, after I started it, I was giving them maybe 30, 35, 40 items a day. And then once it became public, they said to me, I'll never forget it, Gary, you have to limit this to 15 items a day. And it was a Friday afternoon, and I kind of, for lack of a better expression, freaked out. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? How am I going to make these, these are 30 good items, and everybody needs to see everything that very moment. But I will have to tell you that was a great personal learning exercise for me, that if I would make it too long, and people said this to me early on with InfoDOCKET when I was posting 25, 30 items on that side as well. People, I think, were intimidated, if you know what I mean, to just even start going through it because there's just so much there. So with ARL Day in Review now, they first said 15. Now 6 years later or so, we're up to 20. But they're very, and with good reason. And I want it to be this. I don't have an issue with it at all. But 20 items a day, and I think it works well because I think people do actually open the newsletter. It's a website and a newsletter, but if people knew that every time they open it, they were going to see 35 or 40 items 4 days a week, it would just be too much. So I have to, again, make the decision about, at that moment, along with a couple of other people, what is valuable that day and what can wait, or what I just need to pass on. There are other sources that they can go to as well. But I think that's why people have found what I'm doing, what we're doing at ARL to be so useful.
Looks to me like you're actually doing some sort of ranking and selection from quite early on, because there was something called Price's List of Lists.
Yeah, yes, that was, boy, you've done your research. That was extremely early on. I've also, we were talking before we began recording, I have my personal interests as well. They often run together, but one of my, whether if I'm talking about trains or airplanes, some of my, what I'll call my non-professional interests. But I've always loved lists and rankings as well. So very early on, like from day one of my first, actually even before I believe I left library school, I was compiling lists from credible sources. The credible, I use that word quite a bit, and I think that word is even more important now than it was in 1996. The amount of bad, non-credible, whatever you want to call it, deep fakes that's out there is just out of control, and it's only, I think, going to get worse. Because it's basically free to create. And if it gets in the hands of somebody who for whatever reason, wants to get it out there, they can amplify it, is the term we would use. And now, what does this mean? So I think now we're also saying, what does it mean where a lot of the world doesn't have great critical information skills, information literacy, all of that, I think, is becoming part of the issue here. And I don't see it getting better anytime soon, unfortunately. So my approach has always been, well, it would be great if we could have this kumbaya moment and everybody come together and blah, blah, blah. But I think the only thing you can do as a librarian, but also just as a citizen of the world, is to take matters into your own hands. I've also seen over the years, and I'm sure you've seen this too, libraries saying, come on in and we'll teach you about how to use these tools, and we'll teach you, critical information skills. I think for some people that's important, and you got to do it. But we also know that there are people that if you tell them that 2 and 2 is 4, no, they're going to say 2 and 2 is 5. And I don't know if they're even going to find out that the library is doing this, and whatever the library says is not what they're going to believe. What I'm getting at is changing people's beliefs, whatever they are, is very, very, very difficult. And I don't know, is it even possible, especially in coming in for a 1 hour, learn how to use this tool, learn critical information skills session. I don't even know if that's possible. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try, by the way.
Well, you've certainly been presenting information for long enough. You've mentioned InfoDOCKET a couple of times, and that's probably what you're best known for presently. So InfoDOCKET started, I think, around 2010, and now 12,000 stories, at least 12,000 stories later. What was the goal when you set it up?
Well, the goal was just for me to have. Again, similar to what I said with the ARL thing, there's so much out there, and people could use, I would think, a little bit of help getting to credible, timely information in a short amount of time. And there's so much out there. So my contribution is really no different. If you think about, to some degree, I am just building daily collections. I'm just doing collection development on a daily basis from, this is the challenge, a fire hose of material that only increases. There's always new sources out there, and I have to constantly be going through those sources, to both primary sources, which is what I really enjoy working with, and then secondary news-oriented sources. But for example, with whether it be InfoDOCKET or Day in Review, one of the key resources that I use is a tool called Website Watcher, which is a little piece of software that I pay $80 a year for, US dollars. And it goes out to thousands and thousands of sites that I have organized. I was going to say well organized. I could do better with that. But for example, with the ARL was a good example. So I have 1 or 2 URLs for every ARL member. And usually twice a day, I will run this tool, and it will go through those hundreds of pages, usually in about 10 minutes, and it will tell me what on the page has changed since the last time I ran it. And then it will also physically show me what on the page has changed since the last time I ran it. And this is a way I can identify all sorts of things, whether it be a news release, or even in some cases, on Monday it said that Gary was in charge of party planning and travel. And on Tuesday, that party planning position of mine was removed from my bio if I'm tracking my bio page, and it was put under somebody else's. This will even notice those small changes and show me that the person in charge of party planning is no longer Gary, but it's now Peter. And that's what I think that's really valuable, because there's also a time factor here as well. So my goal every day with those 20 items in day in review is that a third to a half of them are new from the past day in the last 24 hours since I last ran it, and we share them there. And I think that's where people find things of interest. And also with ARL, my charge there from them is to not just make it about what members are doing, but what's going on in the larger library space, and even for that matter, even in the higher ed space. So I'm tracking all higher ed issues as well, and I'm going to the primary sources. I'm going to the organizations. I'm going to the think tanks that cover that stuff and looking for material there. And that's what I share in Day in Review, and to some degree on InfoDOCKET. And I have also a number of clients, whether they be publishers, other organizations, that they want to know things that I'm seeing as soon as I see them. So there's a time element there as well. And I think over time, people have come to realize that when they come to one of my sites or feeds, if I can share with them over the course, let's say, of a week, if there's 80 items in Day in Review, and over that week, 3 or 4 of them will be new to them, and maybe 2 or 3 of those would be things that they would want to read, I think I'm doing a pretty good job that way. More, even better, but my goal is to inform people with credible source information in a timely manner, which is really, to some degree, collection development in a weird way.
Do you have any stats on the stories? Do you know what the single most popular story you ever wrote was?
I do not, but I have to say that's also to some degree me, and that is I can let the OC if I want to, and I have a very broad. That's the way who I am too. I want to be as, in many cases, as broad as possible. And I don't want to let stats drive my selection to any large degree, because whatever success I've had to this point is based on what I think is relevant and important. I do get feedback, and I do take that. But if I start driving into the numbers, what's more popular this week than last week, I can start going down all sorts of tangents, and it's going to start over the long term affecting my selection. And I just let the news of the week and my background and whatever determine what I'm going to select. But also, right, with the idea that, I'm not going to get everything in there every day. There's just not enough time, and there's not enough room. So I have to then go back and make even more, even reduce the total number even more, where I try to use my best judgment, quote unquote. And I don't want the numbers. I don't want the numbers to drive what I do.
Sure.
I think then you get into all sorts of other issues, which we're seeing how media now is more interested in how many clicks they get than the actual quality of the story or even what they're covering. So.
Absolutely, yeah, like search engine optimization. So let's talk a little bit about libraries, because you have what I think is quite a unique perspective, in that not many librarians end up being a sort of essentially a kind of a journalist sort of critic role that you have. So do you think that library programs today reflect the needs of current what staff need to do in libraries?
Library science programs?
Yeah.
By library education, librarian education.
Yeah.
Well, I have to tell you that over the course of my career, that topic has come up many times, and I would argue that probably not. That they're not as they need to become a little bit more current. Now, and again, I'm speaking very broadly. I know that there's some great programs out there, but I also have to say that I would argue that some of what I'll call the more traditional skills, however you want to define traditional, are just as vital today as they've ever been. And then if you're going to go down the tangent of, well, AI can do the metadata, AI can do this, AI can do that, perhaps, but I don't know if some of the AI at least is ready for prime time as of 2025, 2026. And I think understanding how things work in a more traditional sense can only help you in if and when the AI becomes the dominant force. Also, there's a need for people to create the AI, to modify the AI. And again, I think a traditional understanding of how libraries and library education works will still be very valuable for at least the near term.
Well, let's go on to that, because you talked at this year's Charleston conference in what I thought was an excellent presentation about a new feature in Gen AI, which we'll come on to. But what I found intriguing was that I'd known you for your news stories. I didn't realise that that there was alongside that some sort of some really interesting insights and sort of analysis of what was happening. So tell me a bit about your view of Gen AI.
Oh, well, this is part one of a never-ending series of videos, because we could go on forever. And by the way, that's interesting that you noticed that about my non-punditry, if you like, in what I post. I go back and forth. Should I be making comments about everything I post? I think what I've learned is I save my commentary for people like you who come and ask conferences, because I don't think that if I had and I don't have instant comments and instant opinions about everything. That's just not who I am. And I think but what I try to tell people is that my selection of what I include and not include is kind of a non-way of expressing my opinion. Because for every item I share on whatever side I share it on, there could be 15 more items. So what I choose to include and not to include is kind of my opinion, at least for that day, about what is important. Gen AI, ask my wife, I spend a lot of money on trying these things. I think it has a huge role and will have a continued role. I don't see it going anywhere anytime soon. I think for the way I think about it, for actual research, however you define that, and again, that's another series of programs. I think it's one thing for productivity, whether it be assigning some good enough metadata, some help you organize. So for example, over the weekend, I'm still looking for stuff for the next week. And it used to be, I would cut and paste everything I found over the weekend, one cut for the title, one cut for the URL, put it somewhere, and then you have to go back and organize it. Now in the last couple of months, all I do is save the URL, throw it on, just dump it into a list. On Sunday afternoon, I have a prompt, and I will tell whatever AI tool of my choice to go out, find the titles, find the source, put the source in parentheses, number them 1 through whatever, put them both on a spreadsheet and in an HTML document, and I'm able to do that now, and it works almost all of the time. Is it perfect? No, but it's a huge time saver just for that particular task. So for productivity, I definitely think it's incredibly valuable. For deep research, I think it can be, and it is, and to some degree, important. And as a professional, I need, and everybody else needs to be aware of it, but I'm not sure if the quote unquote it's ready for prime time yet. We're always playing, we're always trying these things. But just with the hallucination issues, all of that, in many cases, even if you get a fact in a nice narrative paragraph, right? You see what happens if you don't go back and verify each fact or each paragraph, and what can happen if you just dump those citations into a document, into a slide deck. So that's what I find troubling, that people don't even know, people aren't aware of some of these issues. Again, not people who are listening to this program, but the general public. So again, here's another huge opportunity for librarians to talk about the pros and cons and what's good and what's not so good. And one issue too I'm starting to see with AI specifically and Gen AI, and it's very similar to Google, and that is people start using one tool and one tool only. The benefits of being first. Google was not actually first. We can get into Alta Vista and Excite and all of that, but for the majority of the world, Google was first, and now OpenAI was first. And it's a great product. They have a lot of good services, but that doesn't mean that as a professional, you shouldn't be also looking at other tools, whether they be Claude. I subscribe to a service called Poe, as an Edgar Allan Poe, which gives me access to hundreds of different models, and they make it easy to see how a result looks from one model to another. So I would encourage people not to get bogged down into just playing with and or using one model. I think, especially at this point, awareness of multiple models and actually using them in real world situations is a good thing and useful, and a skill that you can take with you no matter where you go or what you do.
So the use case you described seems a little bit like somebody describing, I think, in a very accurate description of Gen AI as like a sort of an intern. Great if you give it precise instructions, but not much good for sort of for the big picture.
And I'll give you another example of how I use it in the last 24 hours. The whole concept of vibe coding. The idea of a person like me who's not a developer and being able to use a tool. There's so many of them out there. I also spend $20 a month on a tool called Warp, one of the many vibe coding tools out there. It's connected directly to my hard drive, and I wanted a tool that would allow me to take ever so many number of web HTML pages and convert them to PDFs. Within 20 minutes, I vibe coded the tool. Now all I have to, it's sitting on my hard drive. It's all run locally. All I have to do is give it hundreds of URLs. Within a few minutes, all of those will be converted to PDFs for what I need to do. And it's just phenomenal for a non-developer like me to be able to at least attempt to do something like that and do it within a short amount of time, and then it works. Now, does it work as well as professionally developed tools on whatever the topic is, whatever the need is? Absolutely not. But it gets the job done for me, and I'm able to do it on my own, literally in a matter of minutes.
But one of the problems, this is exactly the challenge I think we have with Gen AI, that it's to some extent using resources that were never designed to be used the way they are. There's a lovely quote, I think, by Tim O'Reilly, who talked about HTTP, saying, "It was never intended to facilitate secure, automated machine-to-machine data exchange on a global scale." And don't you think that's one of the problems? I mean, converting something to and from PDF, PDF is just not the kind of format that that facilitates sort of sharing, linking material.
Well, right, that absolutely. But there's a tool that I'm using, an AI tool called Pinpoint, which is a Google tool for journalists and for academics that allow you to upload up to 200,000 items. And start using Gemini with that. The issue with that is, unlike Notebook, where you can just give it the URL of a web page and it'll ingest it itself, at this point, Pinpoint only will ingest PDFs. So I have to convert to
Okay.
PDF. But no, I mean, absolutely, Tim O'Reilly is correct. PDF is not the optimum format, to say the least. But in this case, the only way I can do what I want to do with this Pinpoint tool is by putting it into PDF and doing it in a bulk amount in a bulk upload situation. I should say another thing that I'm very passionate about that I think directly relates to our conversation today is I'm also a news source, if you like. I'm also a curator for the Internet Archive. I'm a huge fan of the Internet Archive. I'm a huge user of the Internet Archive. I spend a lot of time archiving things, and actually I'm very proud of my work, because as we're describing on a personal note, yeah, I share news articles. I mentioned the Internet Archive, and Brewster and Mark are very happy that I do that. But I've described to you all this curation that I'm doing for InfoDOCKET, for Day in Review. I have made it part of my workflow that everything I see, which is often, not always, but often very soon after something is posted, I've made it part of my workflow that when I see something, I archive it immediately into the Wayback Machine. Not only for myself, to cover myself, but now there's at least one copy in there, often within hours or at least a day or two of the time it was posted. And I think we're seeing now the importance more than ever of the Internet Archive and the Wayback Machine. It is really, while there are other great web archives out there, it is by far the largest. As you probably saw last month or the month before last, they just celebrated 1 trillion archived URLs in Wayback. So I am really happy, on a personal note, to be part of that and archiving everything that I see every day into the Wayback Machine. And it's just part of my workflow.
Yes, I remember looking up my appalling first website, and it's still there on the Wayback Machine, sort of to embarrass me. Going back to the comparison, the obvious comparison between GenAI and Google, don't you think we're in, to some extent, in the same situation today? You talked earlier on about horizontal and vertical search engines, but GenAI is a kind of generalist, sort of is kind of attempting to be all-encompassing and certainly not built specifically for academic purposes.
No, and I think there's another huge opportunity to be building, training, fine-tuning is another word you might hear, large models, creating small language models for specific needs. And that's where, in a very small sense, a tool like Notebook LM from Google could be helpful. One, it's free. Two, everybody has Google, so there's no cost of entry. And just curating a credible set of sources. It's kind of a LibGuide. If you think about it, LibGuides have always had all sorts of issues in our community. One is the quality of the sources, and two is the upkeep. Now, if you do the upkeep, people can actually chat with those sources. And it's not just text, which is a whole nother conversation. What I love too about a lot of these AI tools, but specifically since we're talking about Notebook LM is one example. With Notebook LM, you can take a YouTube video, just give it the URL of the YouTube video, and within seconds, it's now part of your collections, and you can start chatting with that video. So people will be able to take this podcast that you and I are talking back and forth on, and add that and chat with our conversation. So I think AI has another huge potential, and we're already seeing it, to make the spoken word as researchable as the printed word has been for years. And I think there's a lot of things in spoken conversations that have not been easily accessible to researchers as they can be now. So now if you're researching the history of the U.S. Supreme Court, the history of the Houses of Parliament in the UK, now you can find authoritative people going out, speaking at universities, speaking on podcasts, and incorporate all of those spoken words into whatever your research is. And I think it just makes it so much more valuable and useful.
I completely agree. I have to say, to my shame, that I've been doing these podcasts for about a year, and I've only realised belatedly after starting doing them that there's stuff in podcasts, and not necessarily just mine, but stuff in podcasts generally that you'll never get from the written word. It's remarkable.
Right. And again, I think there's another factor, and why I'm harping on Notebook LM versus other tools is, again, everybody's got Google, so there's no like what's Google and all of that. But also ease of use, right? Ease of use that's another thing I've learned along the way, is ease of use is everything. Perhaps not, again, for this audience, although I think it is, but just for the general public. If you can make it that you don't have to, so with some tools, you might have to go download the audio, download the YouTube video, upload again. For most people, that's well beyond anything they're going to do. But with Notebook LM, all you have to do is take the URL of the YouTube video and paste it in there. So, for example, you could take the last 50 podcasts you've done, and now you could chat with the entire corpus of everything that you said on those. Now, again, you're going to get technical about it, or yes, the speech to text from YouTube videos leaves a little bit to be desired. And I'm also not very good at saying it's good enough, but it is good enough, and at least get you started to then go back and find it, and then listen to that portion with your own ears.
What I find uncanny about going back over some of your stories is how true to life they are. I'll quote just one that I picked up from as long ago as 2007, where you talked about this is 2007, a personal information client that will search multiple databases, dedupe the results, merge them all into one place. Don't you think this is what we've achieved?
We're getting close to that, yes. But again, I will say, in terms of what I do now, it's the quality of those underlying sources that go into this database that you described a moment ago. That's where it's at. And there are so many choices. There are so many tools that are slightly, just like the analogy would be reference books. When I was a kid, my local public library might have, and then of course the academic library went to undergrad or my high school, they might have 3 or 4 or more reference books, but basically on the same themes and topics, right? But they all were from different authors, they were all from different publishers, they were all updated at different times, they were all organized in a different manner. And that's the thing here, is there are even more choices, and knowing and being able to be the person who assembles that, often in a very expedited manner. People need it when they need it and don't need it any later. Otherwise, they're not going to use it. I think it's just a huge opportunity to be going out there and building collections and then having with or without the help of AI to help develop those. Because now we're also getting into the thing too, where, and just in the past week, I'm interested to see, 2 years ago, I gave a presentation and I introduced a lot of the people in that audience to the term RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation. Now many AI tools, Gen AI tools, can go out onto the live web. But just in the last 2 days, we've seen 2 major news organizations filing lawsuits against one of the major players with that, and that being Perplexity. And we've seen lawsuits from the Chicago Tribune, for example, and the New York Times saying in their lawsuit filing, they have issues with RAG and the concept of what it's doing. So I'm wondering if we're going to see more, and we very likely will see more of that going forward. Are we going to have walled gardens that this AI will have a licensing deal that will allow it to get to this news source but not that news source? Are we getting back into the idea that, and we probably are, that one AI will be able to get to certain sources on the web but not others? And what does this mean for research, and what does it mean for the researcher is something I think I'll be watching very closely over the next year or two.
You talked about multiple resources in your local library, but if you look cynically, but I think realistically, at the whole development of search ever since Google and arrived, there's been a sort of a funnel towards just going to one result. Everyone knows that when Google started delivering results, people looked at the first few, but now if you look at the AI overview, I know for sure that I'm sure that most people are just looking at that AI overview and not even bothering with any search results.
Absolutely. So if you then, from a business standpoint, I mean, the power that we're giving just a few companies, in the case of what you said, Google, to be the all-knowing information source and everything, and people don't even click on one of those blue links to go to the underlying source. Personally, I find that a bit troubling, but I'm just one person and I can only act for myself. But what that means and the amount of power that Google has over us, even more now, and I think your example is correct, Google has always had a lot of power over the last 20 years. But as you correctly point out, now it's that AI overview at the top of the Google result page. People don't have any need, they would think, to click to that primary source. So what that means over the long term is, I don't want to, troubling for some, I think, including me, but we'll have to see. And I can only, I can't tell people that don't click, don't investigate that underlying source. but you can see where this might be going, and putting so much power in the hands of one, two, three companies is problematic. And it was funny too. I remember early on, 02, 03, 04, Eric Schmidt, the then president of Google, was saying, search is not a zero-sum game. Well, it kind of has become one, because for most people, web search, and maybe for that matter, research, means going to Google, typing in those typing in 3 words, and then, like you were saying a moment ago, if you want to go old school, then you physically had to go, click on the link, read what was there, synthesize it. Now, in a matter of a fraction of a second, you can get a nicely formed paragraph and you're done. So, again, it's the quality. So the one thing we can control to a certain degree is the underlying sources that are going to be used to create that result. Now, that's easier said than done completely, but that's one thing that I think libraries and librarians can be doing going forward.
Mm. One of the exciting things about your presentation at Charleston, which you said was joint with Peter Brantley, was about this new tool called the Model Context Protocol, which was new to me, and that seemed to be provide the opportunity of actually being able to select from multiple Gen LLMs.
So Model Context Protocol began, we're now at the beginning of December, I think 53 weeks ago. It was started by Anthropic, the people who provide Claude, which is another one of my subscriptions of AI tools that I play with. And I like it quite a bit. But the idea is that what makes it, again, it's an ease of use thing. So now a publisher, any information source, pretty much with an API, and I'm really getting to the most basic level of this, because we could do an entire series, hours and hours. But with very little effort, the end user, for example, with Claude. So I have a Claude installation on my computer. I downloaded the app for OS X, and now I can plug in different databases and query those databases as needed. I can turn them on and off. So now publishers have the potential also to have a little bit more control over where their data is going, especially for real-time use. Now, again, now you're going to get into, well, there's a MCP for this database, and MCP for that database. Which one do I choose? Well, now I think the long term might be creating knowledge graphs, if you like, where metadata and other information will be provided into a database, and a database or even another AI might be able to help you with the selection of which ones to pay for, which ones to turn on, which ones to turn off. Because we're seeing sometimes, right, that smaller is better. It helps improve context. And you don't need everything all of the time. So if I have a specific information need, let's say about sports, there might be 5 or 6 MCPs that focus on sports data. I could turn those on, turn other ones off, so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot of potential there. Will MCP be the protocol that wins out? We've seen it has had a lot of success over the last year, but that's still to be seen. But we've seen a lot of other companies, Google, OpenAI, and the like, buy into it, and we'll see where it goes over the next year. I should also say too, creating MCP servers, there's thousands of them out there already. Getting it all up and running, creating your own if you can get access to a public API. I've been also able to achieve just good enough by using some of the vibe coding tools as well. Mm-hmm. So I think it's an interesting thing to watch, but I think there's a lot of potential there. But of course, I'm going to couch those bets by saying we've seen a lot of cool things happen over the last 20 years, a lot of cool technology that never makes it. But this is definitely one I am absolutely 100% watching. And that's MCP, Model Context Protocol.
Okay. One of the entertaining things about your presentation was that there was a nice kind of double act. You were the sort of enthusiastic one, and Peter Brantley raised lots of comments about privacy. Do you think he had valid objections?
Oh, I think they're absolutely valid. And it's funny because I was saying to you before we began, I used to talk, and I still do talk a lot about online privacy. and digital privacy. Absolutely. We kind of divided it up that way, but I have, whether it be the vibe coding tools and the privacy issues with that and the software that's being created, the privacy issues are not going away. And the amount of data, whether it be MCP or anything else with AI, the amount of data that we're giving to these tools about us, it's not just typing in 3 or 4 keywords, but now it's iterative. And we're telling these AI tools so much more about us and where that data goes. And I would argue too that most people, again, not the people listening to this podcast, but the general public has no idea of all the data that they're sharing. And with an AI tool, it's not just, you just ask, you're going back and forth with it in many situations, which then it's getting more information, let alone the information about where you are literally sitting at that moment, all of that data as well. So, there's absolutely all sorts of privacy issues, both with MCP and with Gen AI in general.
His alarming example was, imagine a research lab where a Gen AI tool could pick up every single search made by that research lab in the last sort of 6 months, and of course, like sort of like a definition of what they're doing.
And then you also have to put trust into the companies that they say, they're not sharing your data, they're not training on your data. Do people take advantage of are people turning those functions off? Are people even aware to turn those functions off? And then do you trust that company to actually do what they're saying? I think there needs to probably be more auditing of some of this stuff over the long term as well. One of the things I've seen over the course of my career, I've had this love-hate affair with Google. I use it all day, every day for so much. But we've also seen, you've seen it too, that Google will say one thing, that they're doing X, and they're not doing Y, and then in some court fighting it comes out to say that they are doing what they said they're not doing. So there's a level of trust here that you have to put with all of these different companies. Again, that's nothing new, but I think something that people need to be reminded of as more and more tools proliferate, especially with the Gen AI, the amount of data that we're giving them. But I don't know about you, but whether it be friends or family, and I talk about, how much are you sharing with these companies? How much do you even know that you can turn that off? Your history with Google, for example, and it probably won't make that much of a difference to how you're searching. And most people, again, not this audience, but the general public have no idea that they can do that and why they would want to do it. So, as my wife would say, at least it gives you something to talk about.
This is an impossible question, but would you define yourself as an optimist or a pessimist when it comes to the future of scholarly publishing?
That's a very good question. Well, by nature, I'm kind of a pessimist, but I will say that for this, I'm hopefully optimistic. But I am optimistic only if people start talking, and I wouldn't say promoting, but marketing, and letting people know at the most basic level what libraries and librarians and the value of what we're doing, whether it be a scholarly journal and how it's. If we don't speak up, was what I'm getting at. If we don't speak up as a community, nobody else is going to do it for us. And if that changes, I think there's a lot of great opportunities there. Not to mention, I do think that, at least for the time being, people do need some guidance, and we have a huge role in that as well. We have a huge role in developing new tools. But again, if we don't speak up and we change the stereotypes to some degree about how not we perceive ourselves, but how the general public perceives this entire community, I think we would be much better off, both short-term and long-term.
You said earlier on, just to sort of to emphasize this, that libraries should be giving advice, even though people are not necessarily going to listen. Do you still think that?
I think, well, maybe not, no, by advice, I mean maybe in a one-on-one group situation, actually going out there, be preemptive to some degree, preemptive librarianship. Find people in the community that you can have a cup of coffee with. And then if you find the right people, again, totally, easier said than done. But one of the things that I was a witness to was the birth of Google. And Google became Google for any number. They were in the right place at the right time. You get into all sorts of issues with why IBM didn't market something, all of that. But Google became Google because they used word of mouth marketing like no other company I've ever seen. They got to the right people with the right message, and they constantly reinforced it. And to some degree, they let the other people do the hard sell for them. And I think libraries could be learning a lot, could have and can continue to learn from that concept. Get to the right people, build relationships with the right people. It doesn't mean it has to be everybody, but with the right people, and let those people do the heavy lifting for you. So your job is to find the right people, again, easier said than done, and let those people do the heavy lifting for you to say. And the value of that is when a peer tells you to try something or to use something or give Gary a phone call at the library because he knows what he's talking about, that's worth its weight in gold versus putting an ad in a newspaper. Google didn't spend any money on traditional forms of advertising for its first decade. Again, they got to the right people and they constantly reinforced that message on a very regular basis. And I think we could learn a lot from that as well.
Just to end on a kind of personal note, can you imagine a time when you're no longer interested in what happened in the last 24 hours and what the latest news in web technology and academic publishing might be?
Now, I just celebrated a new decade about 6 months ago. And that decade isn't 30 or 40. No, listen, for me, this is a lifelong deal. I didn't realize that librarianship was my calling, if you like, until later on, after I thought it would be something else. I should say that other calling was media, film, journalism, and I think there's a huge synergy. I mean, I don't think that needs explaining between the two of them. But like I said, I've been going to libraries my entire life physically. I've always, I used to collect almanacs, that kind of thing. I don't think that, no, for me, I can't see that anytime soon. And I just like to know, I think there's also, right, this is my nature. I like to be up on whatever's going on. And obviously, whether it be, my interest in this community, library, scholarly communication, as I told you before we began recording, I'm a huge transportation geek. I read a lot about that. I guess another way of saying it is, another lifelong love of mine is trade magazines, whatever that industry verticals, if you like. So I do a lot of reading on areas I'm interested in. So no, for me, this isn't going away anytime soon. Maybe turn it down at some point, but not going away.
Well, I, for one, are going to be very grateful that you're doing all that work to sort of not only sort of pick up the news, but sort of analyse it and report on it. So long may it continue, Gary, and thanks very much for your time in talking about your background.
Thank you very much.